Ladies and gentlemen, there comes a time in every life when we are forced to look not outward, but inward. We are taught to fear the stranger in the dark alley, the thunderstorm, the collapse of institutions. But perhaps the most perilous threat lies not outside us, but within, and it is quiet, it is subtle, it wears the mask of normalcy. Today, I speak of the most dangerous sign in a person. Every human being carries within them a hidden world, a secret terrain where denied emotions, buried memories, and unacceptable traits reside. This realm of the psyche, often referred to as the shadow, is not inherently evil or wrong. It is simply unknown. It is made of all the parts of ourselves that we have rejected in order to conform to what we believe we should be. As children, we begin to notice what behaviors earn us love, praise, and acceptance, and we start to disown anything that threatens that connection. If we are told that anger is bad, we learn to suppress it. If sadness is met with dismissal, we smile instead. Over time, this creates a division in the self, a rift between what we show to the world and what we hide, even from ourselves. But the shadow does not go away just because we ignore it. In fact, what we repress gains autonomy and influence in the unconscious mind. These denied aspects continue to live inside us, unacknowledged, festering in silence. They appear in our dreams, in our fears, in our compulsive behaviors. They manifest as irrational reactions, as sudden hostility, as intense emotional projections onto others. We might believe we are acting out of pure reason or moral clarity, when in fact we are being driven by unresolved aspects of the self that are crying out for attention. The most dangerous sign in a person, then, is not the presence of anger, fear, or darkness, but the refusal to admit that such forces exist within them. It is not the shadow itself that is dangerous, it is our blindness to it. When a person rejects their shadow, they begin to walk through life with a false sense of wholeness. They construct an identity based solely on what they believe is acceptable or admirable, and they become rigidly attached to this persona. But beneath that surface, the rejected self continues to grow in power. The more one denies it, the more control it gains. What begins as repression eventually becomes possession, not by an outside force, but by one's own neglected inner life. A person who has never examined their shadow is a person who does not truly know themselves. They become vulnerable to manipulation, to delusion, to the pull of unconscious motivations disguised as virtue or logic. They may seek to dominate others, to control situations, or to silence dissenting voices, not because they are strong, but because they are terrified of facing their own fragmentation. This denial is often supported and reinforced by society. Cultures reward conformity, encourage self-censorship, and punish emotional honesty. As a result, people learn to present a curated version of themselves, both publicly and privately. They become estranged from their inner reality, and in doing so, they lose access to their own humanity. The shadow, which also contains creative potential, deep intuition, and authentic power, becomes a stranger, and what is repressed individually eventually appears collectively. Entire communities, even nations, can fall into shadow when they externalize blame, scapegoat the other, and refuse to take responsibility for their own darkness. History is full of examples where unacknowledged collective shadow has erupted into violence, oppression, and devastation. To reject the shadow is to reject a vital part of being human. It is to live a half-life, to operate from a place of pretense rather than authenticity. The person who has not faced their shadow is not only a danger to themselves, but to those around them. They are unstable not because they are malicious, but because they are incomplete. They do not see the full picture of who they are, and therefore cannot see others clearly either. In this way, the refusal to acknowledge the shadow creates a distortion of reality itself. When we deny what is within, we begin to misunderstand what is without, and we act from confusion, from fear, and from the illusion of superiority. Beware the one who believes themselves wholly good, for in that unwavering belief lies the seed of the most dangerous form of unconsciousness. When a person becomes utterly convinced of their moral superiority, they stop questioning their motives, their judgments, and their actions. They cease to reflect, to doubt, to introspect. They become immune to criticism, not because they are right, but because they believe they cannot be wrong. This belief in personal purity is not a sign of strength or clarity. It is a mask, a defense mechanism designed to keep the shadow buried and untouched. People who insist on their own goodness often do so not out of true integrity, but out of fear of confronting their own complexity, their own contradictions, their own potential for harm. To admit that one is not entirely good is to accept ambiguity, to face discomfort, to live in the tension between right and wrong. But those who demand certainty, who cling to the illusion of faultlessness, are more likely to cause harm while thinking they are doing good. The most terrifying actions in history were not committed by monsters who believed they were evil, but by men and women who believed they were right, who thought they were saving, protecting, correcting. Under the banner of righteousness, they persecuted, punished, and destroyed. The capacity for evil cloaked in virtue is far more destructive than evil that is recognized and owned. When a person denies their own potential for cruelty, they become a vehicle for that very cruelty, only now it operates under the protection of a moral cause. They will not see the damage they cause because their identity is too invested in being the hero, the savior, the enlightened one. They will rewrite events, justify pain, and erase dissenting voices in order to maintain the illusion of their own perfection. In this state, the individual becomes inflated. They confuse their subjective values with universal truths. They lose the capacity for empathy because they see others not as complex beings, but as either allies or enemies in the service of their moral mission. People who disagree with them are not merely offering another perspective. They are seen as threats, as villains, as morally inferior. This binary view of the world, good versus evil, right versus wrong, pure versus corrupt, flattens the rich complexity of human experience and leads to the dehumanization of those who do not conform. Such moral absolutism feeds on insecurity. It is rooted not in true ethical insight, but in the deep fear that the self is not as good as it appears to be. Moreover, this false light does not only deceive others, it deceives the self. The individual begins to believe their own performance. They become trapped in their persona, unable to differentiate between what they genuinely feel and what they think they should feel. They begin to speak in borrowed words, to live by borrowed values, and to mistake conformity with conscience. Their inner life becomes a desert, void of honest self-exploration, of doubt, of meaningful growth. They cease to evolve because evolution requires confrontation with the unknown, with the uncomfortable, with the flawed. Without that confrontation, they stagnate. Their goodness becomes brittle, rigid, performative, and behind that performance the shadow continues to grow, unseen but powerful. This condition is reinforced by external validation. Society often praises those who appear morally upright, who say the right things, who perform virtue in visible ways, but external praise does not equal internal truth. The applause of the crowd can drown out the whispers of the soul. People who are addicted to being seen as good begin to shape their entire identity around that image. They cannot afford to admit weakness or mistake because their worth is tied to the illusion of flawlessness. In the end, this leads to a deep and painful disconnection from others, from reality, and from the self, as they drift further from authenticity and deeper into self-deception. When a person refuses to face their own inner flaws, they inevitably begin to see those flaws reflected in others. Often, with a level of intensity and judgment that far exceeds the actual situation. This is the mechanism of projection, one of the most deceptive and dangerous functions of the unconscious mind. What a person cannot admit in themselves is pushed outward and assigned to the people around them. The selfish person sees greed in everyone else. The insecure person accuses others of arrogance. The repressed aggressor perceives hostility in the mildest of tones. These projections are not deliberate lies or conscious manipulations. They are psychological distortions, a way for the individual to avoid the painful work of self-confrontation by relocating their own darkness into the outer world. And because they feel real, because they are accompanied by powerful emotion, the person becomes fully convinced of the truth of what they see, even when it is merely a reflection of their own denied inner state. Projection is not merely a personal flaw. It becomes a profound social and moral danger when left unchecked. Entire relationships are corrupted by it. When we project, we stop relating to people as they are and start relating to them as symbols of our own inner conflict. We no longer see the other as a unique and separate individual, but as a mirror reflecting parts of ourselves we would rather not see. This undermines trust, erodes empathy, and prevents genuine understanding. The more intense the projection, the more blind the projector becomes, and the more distorted their perception of reality grows. It creates conflict where there was none, and escalates tension far beyond what the moment requires. People start to fight phantoms, enemies that exist only in their own psyche, but are assigned to real, living individuals who bear the consequences of being misunderstood. In communities and societies, projection becomes collective. Groups project their fears, failures, and guilt onto outsiders, minorities, or ideological opponents. They invent villains in order to preserve the illusion of their own innocence. They create narratives where all their problems come from outside forces, never from within. This is how scapegoating begins. When individuals band together in shared projections, they no longer feel the need to examine themselves, because the enemy has already been identified and externalized. The more threatened a group feels, the more tempting it becomes to find someone else to blame, and the less capacity they retain for self-reflection or humility. History reveals, again and again, the horrifying consequences of this tendency: wars, purges, genocides, inquisitions, all fueled by people who believed they were defending truth or justice, but who were really avoiding the terror of looking within. Projection is seductive because it allows a person to maintain a coherent and flattering self-image. It spares them from guilt, from doubt, from the painful ambiguity of human nature, but this comes at a cost. The more a person projects, the more distant they become from their own inner life. They cease to grow psychologically because growth demands self-awareness and accountability. They become brittle, defensive, reactive. Their relationships become filled with misunderstanding and conflict. Their inner world becomes increasingly hostile, but because they do not recognize it as their own, they look for enemies in every shadow, traitors in every disagreement, threats in every honest word. This way of living is unsustainable. It leads to isolation, paranoia, and ultimately collapse as the projected contents of the psyche grow too large and too chaotic to control. To avoid projection requires courage, the courage to say, "Maybe it's me," even when it feels uncomfortable or shameful. It requires slowing down and asking difficult questions about the emotions we feel toward others, especially when those emotions are charged or disproportionate. It requires humility to accept that we, too, are capable of the very things we condemn, and that the human soul is not cleanly divided into good and bad, but is a complicated and often contradictory whole that must be met with honesty and compassion if it is ever to be truly understood. The most dangerous person is not the one who commits obvious harm, nor the one who carries visible flaws, but the one who remains entirely unconscious of the forces moving within them. This unconsciousness is not a passive absence of knowledge. It is an active resistance to seeing, a deep refusal to look inward and examine the patterns, wounds, and motivations that drive behavior. Such a person may appear functional, successful, even admirable on the surface, but beneath that surface is a psyche governed by unacknowledged fear, repressed desire, and unresolved pain. They react rather than respond, repeat rather than reflect, and defend rather than understand. Their actions may seem spontaneous or rational, but they are in fact the product of years, sometimes lifetimes, of psychological avoidance. They are not guided by will, but by compulsion, by forces they neither see nor control, and that is what makes them dangerous, not because they intend harm, but because they do not know themselves well enough to prevent it. This inner blindness does not remain confined to the inner world. It spills outward into relationships, workplaces, communities. The unconscious person interprets feedback as threat, vulnerability as weakness, difference as danger. They resist change not because they dislike new ideas, but because change threatens the fragile self, structure they have built to avoid their own depths. They become reactive, defensive, often volatile, not because they are inherently bad or cruel, but because any challenge to their outer world is experienced unconsciously as an attack on the very survival of their inner structure. Without self-awareness, they are constantly in survival mode, even when there is no danger present. This creates cycles of conflict, blame, and confusion in their lives and in the lives of those around them, all without clear cause or resolution, because the real battle is not happening outside, but deep within. The unconscious person is a puppet of their past. The wounds they refuse to examine still shape their choices. The voices they suppress still dictate their responses. The roles they were forced to play still define their self-worth. They think they are free, but they are acting out a script written in childhood, or in trauma, or in silence. They may feel haunted by the same emotions again and again, resentment, shame, anxiety, guilt, without ever understanding their origins, without ever connecting them to the parts of themselves that have been banished to the unconscious. They blame circumstances, or fate, or other people, never realizing that the storm is inside them. This is not because they are incapable of insight, but because they have built defenses so strong, so automatic, that even the idea of self-reflection feels like a threat to their identity. And so they live in a kind of trance, functioning outwardly while remaining asleep inwardly, locked in patterns that continue until the consequences finally become too painful to ignore. Avoidance is the fuel of unconsciousness. Every time a person numbs their emotions, denies their pain, dismisses their intuition, or distracts themselves from discomfort, they deepen the gap between who they are and who they appear to be. The longer this goes on, the more fragmented they become. And fragmentation leads to instability, because no person can remain whole while living in denial of their own truth. The unconscious person may suddenly erupt in anger they don't understand, fall into despair without warning, or sabotage the very things they claim to want. These are not random events. They are the expressions of a neglected psyche trying to break through the surface, trying to be seen, heard, integrated. But if the person continues to avoid the inner work, the symptoms become louder, the consequences more severe, and the harm more widespread. To remain unconscious is to give up the power of choice. It is to be driven by emotion without awareness, to repeat history without reflection, to hurt others without intention. The most dangerous sign in a person is not intensity or emotion or even conflict. It is the refusal to explore the meaning behind those experiences, the unwillingness to sit with what is uncomfortable, and the fear of knowing who they really are beneath the roles, the defenses, and the illusions they have built around themselves. The solution to the danger of unconsciousness does not lie in achieving moral perfection or adhering blindly to rules, ideals, or systems that promise clarity and order. Rather, it lies in the difficult and ongoing task of inner integration. To integrate the self is not to purify it, but to recognize and accept the totality of who we are, including the parts we fear, reject, or do not yet understand. It means turning toward the shadow, not with condemnation or shame, but with honest curiosity and the courage to listen. The shadow contains the pain we have avoided, the desires we have suppressed, the rage we have denied, but it also holds our creativity, our vitality, our instincts, and our strength. These are not separate from who we are. They are essential aspects of our full humanity. Without them, we are incomplete, fractured, and unstable, constantly chasing an illusion of goodness that leaves us hollow and ungrounded. The process of integration demands presence and attention. It asks that we begin noticing the emotions that arise within us instead of immediately acting on them or pushing them away. When anger surfaces, it is not a call to lash out, but a message to be examined. What boundary has been crossed? What injustice has been felt? What inner wound has been touched? When envy appears, it is not proof of our failure, but a signal pointing towards something we secretly long for, some part of ourselves we have yet to claim. These moments are invitations to look inward, to ask deeper questions, and to stay with the discomfort long enough to uncover its root. This is the work of integration, not quick fixes or surface affirmations, but the slow and sometimes painful unraveling of the lies we have told ourselves in order to survive. It is important to understand that the integrated person is not free of conflict, nor are they always calm or certain. What distinguishes them is their willingness to stay conscious, to take responsibility for their inner life, and to resist the temptation to blame the world for what originates within. They understand that fear is not something to be projected onto others, but something to be felt and explored. They understand that pain is not something to be buried, but something to be honored and worked through. And most importantly, they understand that the shadow is not the enemy, but the teacher, the part of the psyche that holds what is most real, most raw, and most capable of transformation. Integration also requires deep humility. It asks that we let go of the need to be seen as good or right, and instead focus on being whole and honest. This means admitting when we are wrong, listening when we would rather defend, and holding space for perspectives that challenge us. It means recognizing that the world is not divided into villains and heroes, but made of people who are all wrestling with their own inner contradictions. The integrated person does not seek to dominate or control because they are no longer at war with themselves. They do not need to project their pain because they have learned how to carry it. They do not fear their own shadow because they have made a home for it within their understanding of self. Such a person becomes a source of stability and clarity in a world full of reaction and confusion. They do not need to pretend to be perfect, and so they create space for others to be real as well. They are capable of true compassion, not because they are soft or naive, but because they have faced their own suffering and no longer need to hide it. They move through life with a quiet strength that comes from having confronted the darkest parts of their psyche and returned not broken, but whole. Integration is not the end of struggle, but the beginning of authenticity, and from that authenticity comes a deep inner peace that cannot be manufactured, borrowed, or performed. And so, as we move through this life, through conflict, through love, through the shaping of our societies, let us remember this: the person who has not faced themselves is far more dangerous than the one who has. To heal the world, we must first descend into our own depths. The shadow is not our enemy, it is our guide to wholeness. The true threat is unconsciousness. The true safety is self-knowledge. Let us have the courage to meet ourselves. Thank you.